Hi, Karl. Hi, Ira.
Hello,
Hi,
Karen.
Karen.
Yeah, good to have you here today.
Let's say hello, Karl, because I haven't met
Yes,
him.
that's a first time meeting, by video. A
Yeah.
quick, pretty brief email exchange, just,
Ouais.
but that's always about it. So.
Bonsoir, enchanté.
Ouais, bonsoir. Vous parlez français maintenant?
Well, avec un accent spécial, c'est vrai.
It's my
thought it
first
would
language,
be,
so I'm cheating. I'm cheating. That's my first language. But
I thought it would be fun to get started if each of you would just give a little bit about your educational background and what your job is. And then if the two of you could talk a little bit about why you want to talk to each other.
Okay.
All right.
And then I should tell people if they want to know if they want to listen to this or not, that after that, we're going to talk about the intersection of the meaning crisis and libertarianism, otherwise known as Austrian Economics. And then also, if we have a little time, physics and chemistry, and how do they explain the human condition, or can they explain the human condition?
That's big.
So why don't we start with Karl and tell everybody a little bit about your educational background and what you do for a job now.
Well, okay. Well, my educational background, first of all, that's something we have in common. Like everybody knows by now, I lived in France, not too far from Paris, and I actually graduated high school in France. I have a baccalaureate from France. I went to school in Chartres, which is not that, about an hour drive from. And that's where the famous cathedral is, I think most people probably are aware of in one form or another. So my high school was like just almost down the street from the cathedral. I mean, a few blocks away.
Just to interject you, I think this is one of the great things about France is you're down the street from Chartres. One of the great places existing in the world,
Yes.
And it's just there, it's part of life.
Well, so I have
it was awesome. It was awesome. But then I moved to.
A question about that, Karl.
Oh, sorry. Yes.
When you grow up and something like that is like just in the neighborhood, is it just a thing then, or or is it still amazing when you look at it?
No, it's still it's still something very impressive that is recognized as one of the world's cultural marvels, and even for the locals, it's still a source of awe and inspiration. Perhaps somebody that only goes there once in their life or something, but still, it's always, even today. I mean, I was just there a year ago visiting relatives. I have a brother and two sisters that still live in France. My siblings. I'm the only one that permanently moved to the States after graduating high school. They remain. And in fact, a couple of them became French citizens. We were all U.S. citizens, but anyway, so no, it is still considered, even by the locals. I mean, you can see the cathedral from very, very far because it's very flat country.
Yeah.
It depends on which angle you come from, but maybe sometimes for more than 10 miles, 15 miles away, you can already see the cathedral. And it's a very famous landmark, including for the locals. So it's just a marvelous monument. It's just incredible, very awe-inspiring. Particularly when they play the organ there, it's great. So yeah, of course, it's a little different. I actually didn't live in Chartres itself. I went to school. I went to boarding school, so I grew up on a farm outside of Chartres. So it's a very rural, country, and a lot of wheat fields and things like that. So I grew up on a farm there, and I would be in boarding school during the week, and then we'd go home on the weekends, and of course for vacations and stuff. But
and then you came to the U.S.
Kind of interesting.
You came to the U.S. to go to university then?
Right after I graduated. My dad was in the U.S. Army, and he was stationed in Germany at the time I was a senior in high school in France. I took my U.S. SATs and achievement tests at a U.S. high school in Germany, with the armed forces there. And I applied to several colleges in the U.S. I was accepted at UC Berkeley, so that's where I went to school. I went to the University of California, Berkeley. My dad, we had owned a house. Well, we still own it. My dad passed away a couple of years ago, but we have a house in San Francisco. So it was convenient for me because I was able to commute from San Francisco to Berkeley and not have to worry about dorms or renting a place. So that's why, that was one of the reasons I picked Berkeley. But the alternative I was looking at is go to the U.S. Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs, Colorado, because I wanted to go in the Air Force and become a fighter pilot, which I did, but I didn't go to the academy. I ended up going through ROTC at UC Berkeley. And I did end up, so I studied, what I studied at Berkeley is engineering physics. And then I went to grad school for about 6 months. So I didn't get my master's right away, but I was studying physics in grad school. And then I had to go in the Air Force to learn how to fly jets, so which I did. I had a 24-year career in the Air Force, flying fighters, and of course, doing ground tours, in the staff offices, doing various things. So, and then after I graduated, I worked as a contractor for a long time, mostly in Europe, in Germany, for the Air Force again. Then eventually, right now I'm kind of retired. I don't know if it's going to last, but I'm kind of, it's, if I find something I want to do and is enjoyable here in Orlando, I'll probably start working again. But my last job, I was training pilots in Afghanistan for the Air Force. So that was kind of interesting to do back and forth Florida and Afghanistan. And I did that for a couple of years. So, but that's over.
So Ira, give us a little bit about your educational background and what you're doing now.
Okay, so I don't think I was as exotic as Karls, so I was a real American for most of my my life, and my family I was born in Chicago. I grew up there, so I still have a Chicago feel to my to myself with the Cubs and things like this. But when I was about 14, we moved down to Florida, and I went to high school there, and right near the Space Center. And partly because my older brother was a flight fanatic, and still is his whole life. He's loved airplanes and flying. So I spent a lot of time around airplanes, though I've never taken up being a pilot myself. But anyway, then when I was going to university, I really had no plan, no sense, and I just applied to the University of Florida because it was there, and so I just went. And then I ended up becoming a mechanical engineer. Kind of my brother was that, and I didn't have any strong kind of feeling to do anything else that I understood anyway at the time. But I was good at it, and then I ended up going off to Tennessee, which was a very interesting experience living in Knoxville. I tell the story is I moved there and knew nobody at all, and within 6 months I knew where the illegal gambling was, behind bars and things. I was like, if I knew, everybody did. Certainly sheriff knew about it. But Knoxville is that kind of a town. It's very funny. And a very big mix because I worked in Oak Ridge at the big national laboratories there. And you had a mixture. I'd sit, at our apartment bar, with a PhD physicist from New York State, from Cornell, and like an unemployed somebody from West Virginia, and that was the mix. I think that mix is really an important thing. I think it's the same sense that Paul has talked about, and I think Jonathan Pageau of the, living abroad. And Karl's experience certainly is living a lot of places, but you can also get it, I think, of just being in a place like your local bar that has that mix of people that give you a real sense of you're not around your own type all the time. They give you a sense. So anyway, I really enjoyed my time in Knoxville and still good friends with many people there. But then where I was working, I could see I didn't have much. If I stayed when I was there and be technical, if I didn't become a manager, I would be doing the same thing in 10 years as I was doing then. And, it's like 2 weeks of vacation and this kind of thing. And well, what can I do? And I really thought, I was like starting a business or something, and I didn't think I could do it. So I ended up going to grad school and ended up, sort of working my way toward becoming a professor as a way of having more freedom. And that's what I did. I ended up going to grad school at Duke. And again, I didn't apply to many places. I was thinking of going abroad, the same kind of thought in my mind, and was actually accepted to Cambridge and had a thought about going there, but it was very complicated. Where going to Duke I had everything paid for, and it was just done. So I did that and had a great experience there. And I studied fluid mechanics. So this is, again, related to aviation in some sense, a lot of other things, but as a base of understanding the world, a real solid engineering education, I think, in today's world that's so full of technique, different than science, knowing how things work, is something interesting as a way of a base. Anyway, from there, I then became a professor at a couple of different schools. And then a French company was very interested, for different reasons, not to get into, of the kind of research work I had been involved in, and kind of tricked me into coming out and interviewing. And I ended up coming over for a year, and that turned into 14 years now that I got stuck in France, mainly with the French family thing, so I met my wife.
This is my tiny violin.
Yeah, I know. And actually, even better than that, I could talk about things. But yeah, so that's basically it. And I think the thing with Karl's experience, one is that French part, and I'd be interested to know how French versus American he feels. I think of that with my daughter, who I think is very French, and there's only a slight bit of American in her. I'm trying to keep that alive a little bit. And certainly the technical side of things, looking at the world from that sense of technique, which I think is a little bit different than scientific, which is something, if we have time today, I've been seeing over and over again, and I think it's something both you and Karl often bring to the conversation. Here's a scientific concept. How does that relate, say, to the meaning crisis? Or just that the scientific concept is, in the hierarchy, is higher than almost anything else, right? This explains the world. And so it fits now with maybe our worldview, so we bring it up. So anyway, that's my background, and I think those places overlapping with Karl, certainly the way he addresses an issue and talks technically, I can respond to that because I worked with a lot of other people who don't necessarily have that way of thinking about things. And it's, again, those worldviews really come into play over and over and over again, but in all kinds of different ways, not just, say, the religious versus non-religious, but day-to-day and things, how, what occupies your mind and you think is important.
Well, before the two of you jump into it, I just want to say my husband is an engineer. He did mechanical engineering, and but he mostly works with chips and routers and hubs and that kind of thing now. He sort of transitioned into that from mechanical engineering many years ago. But I noticed that the way his mind works is always, how does something work? And if something isn't working, looking for the place that it went off the rails. And he's just so good at that, being able to analyze something, take a look at it, and figure out what can be done to make it work again. And I know that that's something in engineering that I don't notice that so much in science. Science seems to be more like you get some idea and then you just go off in a direction. And science, in a lot of ways, I think leads to kind of an atomization, because everybody is looking for their one specific little area of science that they're going to pursue further and further and further. But engineering tends to look more at the world in some sort of very
pragmatic, practical.
Yeah.
And it is a sense of what we think of as the modern world, I would say, is much, much more of that than science. In other words, much of, certainly in the 19th century, the science followed the advances in technical ability. They didn't lead to them. Building bridges and, well, Chartres, for example, that was way before there was any engineering science. To build a magnificent structure and have it have meaning, but also not to fall down. You look at a modern building, they don't stand up that way. So that is some really, again, that worldview is a bit different. And even though I would say now, my life is, I could easily be described as a scientist in the sense I do work on studies that are sometimes really purely scientific to learn things. I write papers, I review papers, that whole design scientific study. So anyway, it's something, again, I think the three of us might find interesting to talk about eventually as we get through the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I agree. For me, my worldview is kind of a hybrid of a bunch of these things. I studied engineering, so technically I was in the College of Engineering at UC Berkeley, but I studied engineering physics. So by default, it was kind of a hybrid between the pure science. I took a lot of classes that were pure math or pure science, like complex variable calculus and all kinds of stuff. Or even in grad school, I studied just physics. So this was more like general relativity and quantum mechanics, things like that.
But what about when you're practicing as a pilot?
Yeah, all right. So, but also I have, obviously I know a lot about aerodynamics. Now, being a pilot, I was a fighter pilot in the Air Force. They don't require, like intricate details of aerodynamics, but obviously you have to have some basics. You don't need to be able to do differential equations. I mean, I was able to, but most pilots, there were people that were music majors that became pilots in the Air Force. No, they had to have at least some minimal math or scientific background, but it wasn't an enormous amount. And certainly you did not have to be a major. Now, granted, these days it's probably tougher because there are not, I came in the Air Force basically during the Reagan buildup. And so they were hiring a lot of pilots. And so maybe they weren't quite as picky back then. Now it's probably a lot more competitive. But I remember at least my scientific background helped me get a scholarship in ROTC. So the Air Force paid for my college. I did not graduate with any college debt, let's put it that way. But it was, so I kind of approach it from as many perspectives as I can. What I like is, this is a phrase that I borrowed from Professor Gad Saad. I think Paul Van der Clay, named him a couple of times as somebody occasionally watches on YouTube. But it's, I guess he uses the expression nomological network of cumulative evidence. So when I observe the world, I like to look at it from different perspectives. And if these different perspectives all point to the same thing, to me that shows, the corroboration is a sign that there is something underlying here that's real and meaningful, right?
Right. So like a scientific view of that would be, you have like a theory, and then you have an experiment. And anybody who knows the theory knows it's limited, and anybody who knows who does experiments know they're limited. So you really need something to validate each other. Good experimentalists know that, and good theoreticians know that. And this is.
But I like to have different evidence for my worldview from different sciences. Let's put it that way. Like from both the social science. Well, of course, I come from a more hard science background. So, that's something. But as I grew older, when I was younger, I didn't care so much about studying history and stuff like that. I mean, I did. In France, the schools are pretty strict as far as what you must study. You don't have a whole lot of choice. You do have some electives like in foreign languages and things like that.
Well, one thing you might bring up just now in terms of that, still today, all French students take years of philosophy.
Right. So
that's,
I had to take some of that as a, I had, in fact, at the baccalaureate, even though I was a math, scientific major, So most of my grade at the baccalaureate was centered around math, physics, and chemistry. I still had to write an essay. You know, they lock you up in a room for 4 hours and you write an essay in philosophy as part of, like, and it counts towards you either pass, pass or don't pass you towards your grade. So yeah, it's a very, from that perspective, it was a very good thing for me to grow up, and finish my secondary education in France. As a matter of fact, when I showed up at Berkeley, they gave me pretty much, not quite, but my full freshman year as automatic credit. I graduated in 3 years as opposed to 4 for my bachelor's. And that's why I ended up going to grad school, because I had some time left before going in the Air Force.
I certainly noticed the deficit in my own education of philosophy. Because I never got anything on that in high school. And in college, we had the option of taking a philosophy course.
Right.
And it wasn't, the course that I took was not very rigorous. And what I got from it was almost zero. And I didn't even realize the deficit until just a few years ago, when I began looking into philosophy, and I'm like, oh my God, I missed so much. There's so much wonderful stuff out there to learn,
That's right. And my interest in that increased more and more. But even in high school, even before I was introduced to, formally to philosophy, I developed an interest in the philosophy of science, epistemology, on my own when I was like 14, 15 years old. I already started reading some books in those subjects, because the physics interested me. And
Ira, is that an interest of yours as well, philosophy of science?
Well, I think it is, and actually I've taught courses, maybe not directly on philosophy of science, but also like philosophy of engineering, which I think is there. As engineer, I think one of the differences that you pointed to, where you can go off by yourself, where engineering, I believe, is a humanity, in that if you don't design for people involved, if you don't design for people to build what you're designing, you're not a good engineer. It's really rooted in the people who are going to use it, whereas science is somewhere apart from that. You're discovering something that exists by itself, where the engineering is rooted in social life.
Although some engineers tend to forget that.
Well, this is
like you said, good engineers don't forget it. You're absolutely
right.
I think what happens in the corporate world is that the marketing takes the place maybe of the philosophers. Because the marketing comes in and they say, we have to design for people, where the engineers often say, oh, I'd like to design this thing because it sounds like fun. But the marketing guy says, no, you have to design this so it really works for real people.
More than that. Certainly there's a part of you have to design it to sell it, and that's what the marketing guy is going to do. But there's that sense of, simply you could say ergonomic. How are they going to use it? Who's using it? But it gets more. I always thought it was really important about how are you going to make it. So, for example, if you have two pieces of material that you want to join together, well, you could do all kinds of things. You could drill holes and then screw them together. You can glue them together. You can weld them together. And how do you make that choice? Well, there's lots of technical reasons, but also it depends on, hey, in my shop, I've got a great welder. I'm going to go down there and say, I need to put these two things together. What works? He goes, I can weld this in a V. Okay, let's do it that way. Real human interaction to make something work better, be made easier than work better. This is the sense that I thought an aspect of engineering. And then the other big thing with the engineering is the split between, say, the theory and the empiricism of just, we find out what works. So like Karl was talking about using his calculus, virtually no practicing engineer, at least sort of on an undergraduate who goes to work, would ever use calculus. If there's any calculus, it's embedded now in computer algorithms, but often the algorithms, are not even close to being theoretical. So virtually all of fluid mechanics and heat transfer are empirical correlations. And then you just apply the correlation that seems to work best. And that's how you make the choice. And the theory is there to help understand it. after that goes away, and it even gets farther than that. It's so much of the engineering is done by, you say, like a rule of thumb. It says, well, look, I have a house, it's 1,000 square meters or 100 square meters. I'm losing track of those. 5,000 square feet. I know I need to put in an air conditioner of such and such a size. Now, that could be a bad design, but most of the time it works. In some way, what working is getting to the point where something's in place. So there are definitely some differences in that, and I think they have implications in some way in the end of how, again, this hierarchy of who has value. So, and where I was listening, it was a nice, the conversation with Dr. Jim, and Paul, where he was talking about in the hierarchy, the scientists have said, commanded to be, we are the top of the hierarchy, and we set the standard for whatever it is. And I think this is the real issue, a real important issue that in many topics and fields and everything else.
Okay, well, one of the topics I think you wanted to, Karen mentioned earlier on, and something I'd like to, if possible, talk about now, is your interest in Austrian economics and libertarian economics. The two are not exactly the same, but they're congruent. I mean, there is a big overlap. So, because I know you mentioned that was one of the things that intrigued me when I first heard your I think it was your first talk with maybe the second, and with Karen.
Actually,
and because not too many people are exposed to this or have an interest in it.
Well, it's a good point to bring this up, because it relates just to what we were talking about. And I never had a course in philosophy or economics or anything else in school. And the engineering pretty much dominated the classwork. But sometime in the late 80s, it was especially came for me like during the George Herbert Walker Bush.
Yeah.
There was this whole thing about the economy, what it was doing, and we believe the economy is going to do something. They were modeling the economy, and from an engineering standpoint, it was clear that the modelers were failing regularly, to the point of the economy, to the point to say, well, if you were an engineer with this success rate, you may be put in prison.
You'd be at least fired. Yeah, you'd be at least fired.
Hopefully at least fired, but the same people seem coming on TV and talking about the things and having high posts in government. And I really loved the library there at Duke, and I was always going to the library. And through the library, in a different way, I met a woman who she knew a lot of people. She was she was like in the late 70s, and it's a whole nother story. I don't want to get too far into it. But I would have lunch with her occasionally, and at the same period I was thinking about this, I was in her apartment, we were getting ready to go to lunch, and sitting on her table was Human Action, which is the big treatise on economics by...
Back here.
Very good. I'm being blocked by something. I can't see.
But it's on the shelf.
By Ludwig von Mises. So from others, and so this is not a book that most people would recommend to start learning, fundamentals of economics from, but it was there. It's called The Treatise on Economics, and I took it. It turns out my friend had been a good friend of von Mises, and especially his wife. So this was interesting. So I think I actually had Human Action, might have been literally in the hands of von Mises and passed to me as the book I read. And the key thing for me immediately was his critique of econometric modeling.
Right.
This is not billiard balls. You can't do that for fundamental reasons. And that really struck home to me. And I think that sense of the economist acting like they can design the system and know it all from, say, being on top. And there are various reasons, more libertarian, to explain why they have got to this position. the critique coming from von Mises and then more libertarian sense has really struck home and kept with me. So that's the real start of it for me.
Okay, that's really interesting. I mean, mine was a little different, but I was already convinced of those ideas where early. I read Hayek before I read Mises, actually.
Yeah,
but, that's what, that one led to the other and so on. And
yeah.
Reading. But yeah, it's one of the greatest books I've ever read, Human Action. And like you said, as you mentioned, engineering is about people in a way, right? How people both use the technology and also fabricate the technology. In the same way, Mises pointed out that economics is not really about numbers ultimately, although of course they get involved at some point, but it's really about people.
Well, the title.
It's an interaction between people. Yeah, human action. Well, he coined the term praxeology to
right.
the science of human action, and of course human action encompasses much more than just economic interaction. But and his book, he mentions that, but his book is 90% about economics.
No, but he's clear that he doesn't cover those other parts.
Right. He mentions them in passing, but it's not the focus of the book. But nevertheless, he's the one that coined that term praxeology. Praxis being doing or action, and that was a revelation to me. And one of the other things, he was not only a great economist but also a pretty good philosopher. And I mean, not directly, he's not known as a philosopher.
Well, an interesting thing is to follow his life. The life story is very interesting, and that whole milieu in Vienna, where he had his circle of people, the discussion groups and things, and it's really a fascinating time. And of course, there's Freud is around there, but Stefan Zweig and his brother Richard von Mises was a great mathematician.
That's right.
And neurodynamicist, and it's really, again, actually I am for different reasons, but and it's a funny thing of naming your children. I don't know if you had this thing with the different languages. So at the end, my daughter's name is Anna because that's easy to pronounce in English and French, but she has one of her middle names is Louise, which comes for Ludwig von Mises. So, so here's a life, with courage and perseverance and brilliance that, not perfect life certainly, but worth looking at and recognizing. What are the things you will to do in life and try to achieve something.
Yeah, no, it's awesome. So yeah, obviously we have a great common interest there. It's fascinating because most people that you'll meet, they'll like, what? Mises? Who's that? Austrian Economics? No idea. Everybody has more or less heard about Keynesian economics. It's much more mainstream, and that's what the people in universities tend to teach. And it's, even though it's failed over and over again, as you mentioned, that's what brought you to this.
That's what I really just I can't grasp how, after the consistent failures of Keynesian and Galbraith's theories, how they are still.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Well, this is where it becomes more libertarian, and I think Karen, being in a lecture at FEE with Israel Kirzner, that's not typical either.
No, that's another amazing story. Yeah,
so when I hear those things, it's like, wow, it's like, really. But for me, it's like the classic, and of course, there's the whole aspect of Keynes's forward to the German edition of his monetary theory that said this would apply well to Hitler's economy.
Yeah. That's right.
And this is the sense is if you're a government person, it's perfect. It says, if there's any kind of an issue, accrue more power to the state. And so what are you going to teach? What are you going to follow? You're not going to be somebody like von Mises and say, what you're doing is bad. Give up this wealth, give up this power. Don't take it from people and let them live their lives. That's not what you want to hear. And
But the bigger picture to me was, and of course I mentioned this several times with Karen, and we talked about this when I first talked to her, but it was the failure to distinguish between complicated systems and complex systems.
yeah,
Right. So the Keynesians see the economy as like an engine or a clock. And if you tweak this knob, this rheostat, you can then, which typically are like interest rates or, put money in the system, then you can very accurately, or maybe not as accurately as a, very precise Swiss clockwork, but at least to some extent, you can say, if I tweak the interest rate this way, the economy will grow at 3%. And if I do this, and if it doesn't, then I can inject money in the system and I can borrow money and I can all these things. And we will have a very predictable result. And it's a completely wrong picture of what an economy is. Because an economy is truly, a really excellent example of what a complex system is. It's the interaction of many, many parts that actually, when put together, is more than the sum of each individual part. And that it creates an order. So there is still order. It's not anarchy, like Marx would say, well, it's the anarchy of the market. On the contrary, the market is one of the most orderly things, as long as it's not interfered with too much, that's the big thing. But it creates its own order and finds its own equilibrium from within, from the sum total of all these various interactions that each interaction is very local.
Or in a very technical sense, and this is one of the big things goes on and on in the human action, and Rothbard after that, is it's never in equilibrium, actually. It's one of the big fallacy.
But that's correct. Okay. Adjusting. That's a good thing that you, yeah. Thank you for pointing that out, because when I say equilibrium, I mean, it's not an equilibrium in the sense of a long-term equilibrium. It's just, at any point, of course, there is something close to an equilibrium, but you're absolutely right. It's never really an equilibrium. There's always innovation. There's always changes. There's always,
well, there always has to be a
little. It's very dynamic. It's a very dynamic system.
Right? In any complex system, there always has to be a little randomness that keeps it from solidifying.
Yes, we talked about this on our talk last time. That's absolutely true. But so, to me, it boils down to, and I think that's the confusion between complexity and mere complication is the cause of a lot of misunderstandings in the world. And I think one of the authors more recently that has been very excellent at pointing this out is Nassim Taleb, right? So he, the author of Black Swan and Anti-Fragile, and more recently, as a couple of years ago, Skin in the Game, right? So that these are all concepts that he has revived and brought to the fore, and pointed out that if you keep making the mistake like the Keynesians do, and he's very critical and about. He's
got a real personality, that guy.
Well, yeah, I know he's a genius, but he's not the most. Let's just say he doesn't mince his words, for one thing.
Well, so I want to jump in and ask you a question, both of you, maybe, since you've followed this guy. Why does he hate Jordan Peterson so much?
Well, you could.
Does he? I mean, that's the first time I've heard that he actually hates him.
He is just vitriolic against Jordan Peterson.
Okay, well, I guess I haven't followed that.
He calls him a scam artist and
well, then I would disagree with that.
Well, he's vitriolic against a lot of people. I mean, it seems to me. I mean, I don't follow those, but every once in a while you see somebody will post a Twitter exchange where, it's
right.
And, the one part is, again, very much to say, I have no idea really, but some people get jealous of other success. It's one of those things in the world. And he's a very successful guy, Talib, but somebody's selling more books, or somebody criticizes him, something he said, and he takes it.
I guess, yeah.
But I don't know. That's one thing that crossed my mind. But otherwise, it's like, why are you so angry? It's not clear.
Right, I can see him being. he criticizes people like Sam Harris and Steven Pinker, calls them names basically. I did not know that he felt the same way about Peterson, but that already surprises me, because if there is somebody that does understand the complexity of the world as a complex system, I think Peterson does a good job.
There's also the sense maybe he's sensitive because there's some of those people who have been out in the world for a long time and have had to deal with criticism and other things that, they're fed up with it. So don't.
Yeah, I guess. And Taleb has been a person who has defended religion he's a Christian himself, I think Orthodox, because he's originally from Lebanon, but he has defended the idea that religion serves a good purpose and things like that. That already does surprise me that
actually
that vitriol
directly Karen's question.
Okay, I'll look it up.
I have no idea either, so it's
I will look it up.
Well, I didn't mean to throw a wrench in the works here.
No, it's okay.
I did want to bring up something else that since we just have a little bit of time left to talk about, and that is that given the fact that that economies are complex systems because they're made up of people, basically, and the desire to see it as a complicated system, I think, comes from some sort of motivation.
Sure.
Because complicated systems can be controlled by people. And to me, the huge difference, the fundamental difference between the viewpoint of Austrian economics and the other economic systems that tend to allow world economic systems to collapse or to get so tangled up that they're just impossible for everybody. The big difference is that Keynes and Galbraith don't take into account human sin at all. And Austrian economics is the only viewpoint that allows for human sin. I mean, it's the only one that acknowledges that human sin is the problem that it is. In the same way that the United States Constitution is the only constitution that takes into account human sin and the nature of some people to desire to control other people. And what do you do about that? And that seems to me to be one of the most fundamental questions in the entire universe. Where did human sin come from, and what do you do about it?
Can I just make one slight change the way you formulated the question?
Well, I was just off the cuffing it there, so
no,
I would love to have you clean that up for me, Ira.
I was about to say the same thing in a way about going on from the Austrian economics is often exactly the right word, say, that has been used, like Walter Block say, or something, is that it has no morals. It's purely descriptive of, look, if you want to run the world and keep and steal from everybody, don't run a free market, because that's not what it'll do. If you want to produce more in the world, have a free market. If you want to produce moral people, have a free market, but you need something else, because the free market won't necessarily by itself make moral people.
Mm-hmm.
But in that sense of, so I can't remember the phrase you used to say that, but the sense of it's this purely kind of descriptive sense of how human people act. Like, again, if you want to produce more, prices are necessary. Right. And then with prices, you have to have freedom to have prices. So then
Mises basically was of the view that, praxeology says if you want result A, then do B. If you want result C, do something else. But it doesn't tell you whether you should prefer B to C.
Right.
It tells you if you want this, do that. If you want this other result, do something else. But it doesn't tell you whether you should, what your end goal is. So it's not teleological in that sense.
Right.
Now, but then of course he says, well, but you probably most people would agree that people prefer prosperity over, being poor. And so he goes on to say, well, so even though, we can't force people or, tell people you should want this, in practice, most people will want to have more goods than fewer and, be a little bit richer, at least well off rather than dirt poor. And so therefore capitalism is the way to go.
Yeah. Well, we could take the morality farther and say within, and again, we say capitalism or a free market system of a system of exchange being free,
right.
that some people might choose to be less well off. They might want to join a monastery.
Their choice. That's right.
But there's choice, and we won't have something to constrict you from doing that. But we have to have something where if people are not moral, the free exchange won't happen. This is where things I think have been building in some of the libertarian community to recognize that it can't be just a non-aggression principle.
Right.
That it has to be, people have to have a certain sense of, I recognize the rights and the positive aspect of this other human being, so I don't want to cheat them. I don't want to steal their things, even though that might make me feel better. And this is what sets up the dynamic to make the market work. But we have to have a culture to do that. And where did that come from? And this is an interesting historical question.
That's partly why, when I was younger, I did consider myself a libertarian, and I tended, as I grew older, I became more of what I would think a conservative, although, with libertarian leanings. And it points to exactly what you just mentioned. I thought that the moral aspects that pure libertarianism was putting forward were a little too thin for my own taste. I don't think it was sufficient. Non-aggression principle, okay, it's great, but I thought it was not sufficient. There's more to it than this. It's got to be.
Well, define aggression. People define it.
Well, but so there is a whole cultural background to it that's necessary for people to get along with each other in a free market, and so it's a lot more complex than it seems at first. But I think libertarians or certain brands of libertarians tend to underestimate the role of the cultural background and cultural values,
especially the libertarians who are more libertine. They say, "Look, I just want to
exactly,
smoke pot or do whatever,
exactly,
and I don't want any of those rules over my life." So I once wrote something saying I was a reactionary libertarian or a libertarian reactionary. There's this sense of you can't just live without boundaries.
That's
constraints.
Right, exactly.
But where are they going to come from?
And that's where religion, to me, is huge part of Paul van der Klee's program, with his videos, is to show how religion fills that role, and so I agree with it. Like I just commented on one of his videos, I guess his latest video today, with a lady called Sarah.
Yeah, I just
posted it. Yeah, right. I just watched it. So my comment was, this again, you nailed it. It still doesn't help me become religious, but it reinforces my belief that religion is extremely valuable for something like this. I can't remember the exact words, but there is, right. So that's for me, it's still a dilemma, between the recognition that it's probably something that's needed, or at least, very strong cultural values. And quite frankly, for the average person in the street, perhaps the only way to maintain those values is through religion. I completely agree with that. But nevertheless, at the personal level, even if I understand that, it doesn't help me having faith, right? So it's difficult for me because. And I mentioned this to Paul as well, and he commented back. Let's say, well, you're making a great, I called it an instrumentalist case for religion, in the sense that it fills a needed purpose in our social life and culture. But, technically, from your point of view, that should be irrelevant, right? You either believe or you don't. And trying to justify it in instrumentalist ways seems to be, in a way, superfluous. it's not superfluous in arguing against like the hardcore or celebrity atheists like Sam Harris, right? Who basically denigrate religion at every opportunity they can, they get. So, and basically, or like the late Christopher Hitchens, it's God is not great, and religion is the source of all evil, and period. So obviously, to combat that extreme view, what Paul is doing is obviously extremely useful. But for people like me, he's preaching to the choir in a sense that, yeah, I see the practical value of it, but I suppose it still doesn't help me on the personal level. That's something I have to figure out for myself. So.
Could I ask you one kind of little personal question, Karl?
Yes, please.
Is it that you see the practical necessity of religion for other people, but you don't see any practical necessity for yourself? I mean,
see, that's very hypocritical. You could say that's hypocritical in a way, right?
No,
It's good for the masses.
I didn't.
I know you did not mean that. I know you did not mean that, but I have thought about that many times, right? I mean, if I'm going to say yes, it's needed for to put it in an extreme way that would sound hypocritical. So, yeah, for the masses it's needed, but not for me because I'm smarter than that. And that sounds bad, right? But no, it's not like that. But I do, like Paul's comments about religion being a way to make, that's accessible to everybody. It's not just for the intellectual class or for a certain class of people. It's meant to address as many people as possible, no matter what their social classes, no matter what their intellectual capacity, no matter what their background. That's really it's very powerful. I mean, that religion does that, especially Christianity. When I say religion, in general, you could argue, well, any religion fulfills that role, but I will make no secret that I think some religions do it in a better way than others, right? So and of course I would put Christianity on top of that. So
I have to say I completely resonate with what you're saying, Karl, and there's a little part of me that feels kind of maybe the word is uncomfortable or unfinished when I hear Paul talking that way, because it's as though that somehow saying religion can fulfill this need, religion can answer the meaning crisis, some sort of system of rules or traditions can fill the need that people have, because that is so far from what faith means to me.
Right. And that was my point to him.
Yeah,
yes.
Because for me, God is a radical lover. He's chasing after us, and he wants that personal, intimate opportunity to communicate with us and to talk to us and help us and guide us and comfort us and all of those things. So it's not, for me, it's not to be found in all the traditions of the church, or it is to be found in his word, certainly, and in his truth and in the great historic truths of the faith and all of that. But it's not about a better system, because and to me, that's the reason that I really like the whole free market economic idea, is that it's about the one and the many, and it's this picture of calculus. There is the one, and then everything is divided up into the many. Ira, I see you ready to say something.
Well, just a couple things related to it is I think there's a real aspect of the free market. Again, every individual counts, is important. They're not a cog in a machine. Mm-hmm. And the historical fact that coming from the one guy 2,000 years ago, in our sense of the world, is to value every individual.
Right.
Those things really happened. It's not a theory or anything else. You can do all the history, and it comes to that. This is some of the, I didn't know of René Girard until recently, Paul bringing it up, But I think this really reinforces some of those aspects. And so this one I bring a little bit back to what Karl was saying, and I think I understand it a lot in the sense of, where do you get to the point you say, I believe, but I think something is true. So as a scientist, say, I have some evidence, I have this data, this experiment, and it's never perfect. There's always uncertainty, but there are different pieces to come together and say, I have these pieces of data, and now this explains, at least up to now, what I think and is useful, so I think it's true. Now, I would say that's more of the way I've thought about Christianity. It's like you're living through life. I think there was something more spiritual there, but most of what I have in my head is sort of like the way I think about gravity. I've never touched gravity. I've never actually seen gravity. I've seen its effects over and over again. Somebody's given me a theory of why it's the case. Given all that, I think gravity is true. Well, that's what I've seen in the world. Bringing love to the world, agape, it's what works for sure. And one guy brought that into the world. And he lived 2,000 years ago. And this all happened from that. It showed that. And other things, like Karl was just saying, other religions, I don't see that sense of the agape and every individual having worth, which I think is fundamental.
Yes.
And so, given all that, okay, I think that's enough evidence for me to live my life based on that. But in the sense of what does that mean in terms of belief? If I really got into it, I've never touched it, never saw any mystical experience, but it's all there every day, every single day. I see that. That makes sense.
Yeah,
Based on
excellent.
the look on your face, Ira, I'd say that brings you a lot of joy in life.
There's no question, and I see the pain in other people when they don't. It's over and over again. It's like, yeah, why are you in so much pain? Because you think somebody's hurt. And even that to the point where I think I'm pessimistic about some things, but I never take people for doing things to me out of malevolence. I know it exists, but so often, you're in these organizations and people act. Paul said once, culture eats the lunch of intentions every time. So people mount the hierarchy, and I don't know if Karl knows some of the French hierarchy. It's really something. But
yeah, they like their bureaucracies. That's
and then
sure.
you act a different way. You in the sense it's okay, it's not them. But the more you can get beyond that, and you really care about people, it just returns 7 times 7 or whatever. I've never studied the Bible really. I've studied Austrian Economics much more than the Bible. But if I put the two together, I think the Bible, Christianity, say faith, or this set of understanding of the world is more important than understanding Austrian economics, say. But both worldviews are super important to me in that each day the world goes by, they inform me, and I think I understand the world much better for both of them. Really understanding what's going on. Like engineering helps me understand why the car doesn't work, the Christianity and stuff. And then I would say, just adding on, just to complete a little bit of why we're sitting together, is because we all started watching Jordan Peterson and started watching Paul and then these others. That psychological part I had never really paid much attention to, at least in the way some of the psychologists have talked about things. And now I found it's quite helpful, especially with my wife. I can, okay, let's talk about things in a certain way that doesn't change what I really think about things, but it makes me understand a better way to make contact with her that otherwise, we talk past each other. So it's these worldviews and where they come together.
Well, and the thing I see that connects all of them together is that they're each a way of observing reality.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
Just observations. So Austrian economics simply observes people the way they are, and the Bible observes people the way they are. You know, there's some pretty ugly stuff in there about humanity, but that's the way it is, you know. And psychology, if it's done well, is just observing people the way they are. So it's
and of course
very, very connected to reality.
Yeah, and when you see Vervaeke and he connects, you know, it's, oh yeah, that in Peterson, it was like, well, those things overlap, and so they make sense. So at some point, if they don't overlap, you know, then where's your hierarchy and what you're going to believe? But I would say, just for me personally, by taking the worldview, and again, it's always being updated, but that worldview of, say, Austrian economics, then that worldview of Christianity, and really having a sense of, trying to have a sense of Jesus' message, it even if life is going bad, I mean, it's actually works the best in the midst of the worst suffering, at least, again, from what I can see. It's not that you know, life is always going good. It's literally because life is always going bad that's make you understand how that's happening and what's going on. So, and I guess I'm saying in a way, in terms of what Karl was saying, which I really, really understand. It could totally, I easily could see myself being exactly like Karl. And maybe that's the gift of faith for me somehow, where it came to. But that sense of empirically is what I see in the world.
I will, let me add something to that, though. I'm going to play devil's advocate just a little bit. Because I completely agree with the view. No, I agree with to me, you know, Christianity and the Bible works, you know, in harmony with free market economics. But I'm sure you well know that there are some Christians who will tell you the exact opposite.
Oh,
right?
For sure.
Oh, yeah.
So that's just, I just wanted to point that out, that it's not necessarily a universal view to say.
Actually,
I mean, I agree with you. No, I agree with you. So
I'm just
saying we should. There are certain factions within Christianity, and I would even argue to some extent the current Pope, you know, Catholicism. Who would argue the other way, and you hear it. You know,
well, but it's
often
impossible. It's impossible to argue the other way if you take the word as a whole. If you cut sections out and erase them and draw through them with a black marker, then yes, you can get to that other point of view. But if you take the word as a whole, you can't get there. Taking
Karl's point, you certainly have a history in the church of, say, against usury, having interest rates.
Right.
I mean, and I think and I guess I have one of those things where, like, I think Paul mentioned it, having like two minds. There's a sense of all the Bible controversies. And then now in life, I live in this French world with English and try to translate. And it's like, I can translate between these things, and recognizing every bit of the Bible that I could possibly read has been translated multiple times. You know, and let alone how difficult some of it is to understand. I'm not going to be arguing about a single word. No way, in any way. So, but the sense of some of those aspects, there's a really nice history, a big history of economic thought by Murray Rothbard. And I don't know if you know of him. He was a real disciple of von Mises, and was Jewish, I think not religiously Jewish, more like an atheist, and he has this whole long history, and then he ends up becoming like a scholastic, saying the natural law is necessary, and that sense of bringing things together, you know, I think when you look hard enough, the connections make sense, I think. Now, I'm sure there are good arguments people can make for other sense of, you know, what it means. Certainly, I've been trying to do some daily reading of the Bible, like in an app on my phone, you know, and all the parables are incredibly difficult to understand. what does that mean? You're supposed to do this or that. And I think Paul started to mention some of those things. And yeah, you can take it different ways. The only thing I can say for sure is that sense of agape. That's the message. And if that message is taken, the rest rolls from that. But you're right, of course.
But nevertheless, and I've mentioned this before, it's the Christian value for the dignity of the individual, I think, I don't think it's replicated in too many other places. And that's,
I don't know.
It's so fundamental to how we act. Now, it took centuries and centuries for it to be fully, or well, you could argue whether it's fully implemented or not, but more fully implemented than it was 1,000 years ago, or whatever. But nevertheless, I see that as a key driving factor, to the point that people like Sam Harris and other celebrity atheists that denigrate the contribution that Christianity has made to our current culture and prosperity are way off the mark.
Yeah.
Particularly like Steven Pinker, his latest book, and like to think that the Enlightenment was, what was a reaction against religion is to me is ludicrous. And Paul has talked about this. Paul did a great job about debunking this view. Also, I'm not going to repeat it, but I fully agree with Paul on that. The Enlightenment would never have happened without Christianity. Yeah. It would never have happened.
When I was watching the interview with Peterson, where Peterson asked him, "Well, don't you think Christianity has something to do with it?" And
yes, I know exactly. I mean, not more than just a little something. I mean, a lot. Yeah. No, then of course I would agree that the Enlightenment did then have an effect on modifying some Christianity in itself. So it was kind of a give and take. But I would say Christianity gave a lot more than it took, right? So that's again from a purely practical point of view, I think there is no doubt about this.
Sounds like it's about time for us to finish up.
Yeah,
I'm getting shut off here. I got I have a small apartment that okay. And I'm not the number one on the hierarchy here.
Well, this has been a delight to talk to you two guys. I hope we can do this again.
Yeah, we've got a lot more to talk about. Yes.
Yeah, I think I didn't get to any of my big questions that I wanted.
Well, this was the introduction, I guess, and the next time we can get to more of the meat of the discussion.
Write them down, and in the next time you contact me, tell me what is the best time for you, because I can readjust my schedule to make it work for the two of you.
Yeah, I don't know if I have a better time. It's just this is.
It's the evening in France.
Yeah, in the 800 square feet or something, and the family's here, and paper thin wall, and you can't just do something.
Thank you so much. I'll see you guys soon.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.